Okay, let's get started. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar covering the recently released interim guidance for preparing CE documentation using programmatic CEs and adopting in other agencies' CEs. My name is Dave Jacob. I'm the branch manager for the Planning and Compliance branch at the Environmental Quality Division, or EQD, located in the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science Directorate. Today, I'm joined by Lindsay Gillum, our NEPA technical specialist, who'll be giving the presentation, and Kelly Daigle, who's one of our project managers here at EQD, who'll be helping with the question and answer session. EQD is the service-wide NEPA policy and guidance office. We also manage a number of the more complex, controversial NEPA projects for parks. Hopefully, you've all had a chance to review the online training module that was circulated with the invitation for this training. It provides a more in-depth discussion of how to use and apply CEs. Today's webinar will be focusing on how to document categorical exclusions. We'll also briefly talk about programmatic CEs and cover CE adoption, which is an option under the 2020 CEQ NEPA regulation revisions. Many NEPA practitioners out there have noted that much of the information in the interim guidance isn't really new, and that's correct. While the CE adoption piece is the only brand new topic, the interim guidance provides more details on how to adequately document CEs than are currently included in the NPS NEPA handbook. We noticed when doing some quality control of CEs in Pepsi that there are a few aspects of CE documentation that could be improved. And furthermore, the 2020 CEQ regulations encourage the use of CEs whenever they apply. So we anticipate using more CEs than we have in the past, and wanted to make sure folks out there have proper direction on how to adequately document CEs going forward. So Lindsay's going to start the presentation. Please make sure to stay on mute during that time. There will be a question and answer opportunity at the end. And during the presentation, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat and we'll try to address them following the presentation. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lindsay and we can get started. Thanks, Lindsay.
Okay, can you hear me? Kelly, can you confirm?
Yep, we can hear you, Lindsay.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks, Dave. I want to begin by quickly reviewing some categorical exclusion or CE basics. If you would like to know more details about CEs, including how to determine whether a CE applies or the process for using them, I encourage you to review this CE training module that was attached to the invite for this webinar. CEs are a category of actions that have been determined to have no potential for significant impact and therefore do not require an environmental impact statement. Using a CE is a pathway to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and it is the simplest and most commonly used NEPA pathway. The NPS NEPA handbook is your primary reference for using CEs. The list of CEs is included in the handbook, as well as the process for using them, which we will be briefly discussing today. As many of you likely know, there are two different CE lists. The lists of CEs in the handbook in 3.2 do not require documentation. The list in 3.3 always require documentation. Documenting the 3.3 CEs is the focus of this webinar. Section 3.5 of the handbook includes the list of extraordinary circumstances, and we are going to talk a little bit more about those in a minute. The NPS NEPA handbook has some additional information about the CE process, but I do want to briefly review the process here with you. For all CEs, whether using a CE that does not require documentation or one that does, you begin with a proposed action or something that you want to do. What is the action you're proposing to take? Next, you should review the CE list to determine whether the action fits within a CE category, and then determine whether an extraordinary circumstance applies. Assuming that a CE applies and no extraordinary circumstances exist, for CEs that do not require documentation, this is the last step. For CEs that require documentation, you will need to take some additional steps. The two bullets highlighted here are bold because they are the focus of today's discussion about documentation. We're going to talk about how to document these steps or these questions. We encourage parks, if possible, to set up an IDT or a team of park staff that can help the compliance person review the proposed action and determine the potential impacts of the action and help determine whether the action fits within the CE. For CEs that do require documentation, you will need enough information to document the required content for the CEs, which we will go over in a minute. If you're not sure how to set up an ID team for your park, I encourage you to speak to your regional environmental coordinator, and they will probably have some ideas of what might work for your park. Finally, before taking action, you must have the superintendent sign the CE. The signature may be digital, but the CE form or the writing must be signed. I want to quickly review CEs that do not require documentation before moving on to discuss documentation in detail. CEs that don't require documentation do not require you to fill out a CE form or create a PEPC entry. However, there are instances where you might want to note that you are using a CE that doesn't require documentation. So administrative actions, those day-to-day actions that you take at the park, likely do not need any sort of notation or documentation that you're using a CE to cover them. But if you're taking actions where you think someone might ask you whether you completed a NEPA review for the action, it is best to document the use of the CE. Examples might include development of plans, regulations, guidelines, and potentially some activities under the CE 3.2E. You can quickly document the use of CEs in an email, on PEPC, in a memo to file, or potentially in the document if it's a plan or a guidelines document. Again, this does not require using a CE form or filling out an ESF or some other documentation that we're about to discuss. This is just writing down that you thought about the action and that you're noting that a 3.2 CE applies. You're noting that a CE that does not require documentation applies. Finally, remember that if an extraordinary circumstance applies, you should revise your proposed action or likely prepare an EA or an EIS. The following slides will address how you document CEs that require documentation, or those CEs that are found in section 3.3 of the handbook. I'm going to begin with an overview of the content that you should be documenting in PEPC. First, you should describe the action you're taking, including mitigations, in enough detail that you can understand whether the action falls within the category of the CE and what the impacts will be. You should consult the NPS NEPA handbook and identify which CE best fits your action. Then you should justify why the action fits within the CE. Now, this particular section has created a lot of confusion in the past, and I'm going to show you some examples in a minute. The CE justification is not the justification for the project or the need for action. It is an explanation of why the action fits within the CE. Next, you should describe the impacts of the action. The description of the impact should be commensurate with the impacts that will occur. So let's say you have an action that will result in a lot of impacts to your park resources. You'll need more analysis than if your action has very few or very limited impacts. So we recommend describing the impacts of the action in PEPC on the environmental screening form, or you can use a standalone analysis document. Doesn't really matter. Finally, you should document that none of the extraordinary circumstances apply. Generally, 1 or 2 sentences documenting this is adequate. However, you might need to provide a more lengthy analysis if your impacts are extensive, and I will show you some examples of this in a minute. A few other important thoughts about documented CEs. You may need to engage stakeholders, including other agencies or the public, depending on your action, So just because it's a CE doesn't necessarily mean that there's no public engagement. I also noted on an earlier slide that your CE should be signed by the superintendent. I want to highlight here that simply clicking Compliance Complete in PEPC is not a signature. Also, other compliance, specifically Section 106 consultation, must be complete before you sign your CE. And finally, you should upload your signed CE form to PEPC. And we're going to discuss the decision file and more information about how you would do this at the end of the presentation. The next 4 slides, my hope is to provide you some examples of CE documentation in PEPC. This screenshot is what you will see if you're in PEPC under Natural Cultural Compliance in Step 4, again in PEPC. And I'm going to focus the next few slides on the CE justification section, the extraordinary circumstances, and I will end with an example of some ESF analysis. As with all the examples that I'll be sharing today, there's always improvements that we can make, but these examples demonstrate here are of CE justifications. So in both of these examples, the author has described the action and why it fits within the CE category, specifically addressing the important boundaries the CE describes. So in the first example, the CE that's used covers the installation of underground utilities in either a previously disturbed area with stable soil or within an existing right-of-way. So an adequate CE justification should demonstrate that the action is 1, an installation of an underground utility, and 2, that the action is either in a previously disturbed area with stable soils or in an existing right-of-way. In this example, the author describes in the CE justification how the action meets these requirements by specifically identifying that the action is 1, an installation of an underground telecommunications line, which is an underground utility, and 2, that the area is both previously disturbed and within an existing right-of-way. In the second example, the CE covers a variety of activities you might be doing on roads. The CE requires that the actions only occur on existing roadways. Here, the CE justification describes that the proposed action is the same as the type of activities listed in the CE and specifically notes that the action is within the existing road footprint. These are simple but good examples of CE justifications. Before I move on, I want to note that these examples are for these specific CEs. If you're using a CE that is limited to an action with no or only minimal environmental impacts, your justification will need to explain how the impacts are either minimal or there are no impacts. You can incorporate by reference analysis that might be included elsewhere in your record in the CE justification to explain that. Another word I would highlight that's found in a number of our CEs is the word minor. If the CE includes this modifier, for example, minor construction or minor trail relocation, your justification should discuss why that action is minor. Next, I'd like to share some examples of extraordinary circumstance analysis. This is one area where we noticed that we need a little bit more explanation in our CEs. When you consider extraordinary circumstances, we've recommended documenting more than simply clicking the box no, that the extraordinary circumstance does not apply. So this is a screenshot from PEPC, and you can see here the author has selected no, but they've gone on to document a sentence or two about why. These are a few examples that I like because they demonstrate how you might document that an extraordinary circumstance does not apply for a project with limited impacts. As noted before, you might need to spend more time on these if impacts are nearing significance or if the project has a lot of impacts. I like these particular examples because the author uses because statements to explain why the circumstance does not apply, rather than simply stating that it doesn't apply. And I think this is a best practice. Note for the extraordinary circumstance for historic properties, the author references other material in their explanation. This is appropriate and recommended. I'll also note that if there was an adverse effect to a registered property, this explanation would likely need more information, including the mitigations in place to reduce the impacts below significance. Similarly, you might be using a CE for an action that adversely affects a listed species. In that case, the discussion in your extraordinary circumstances should describe the mitigation and other measures. Finally, I'd like to show you some examples from an ESF analysis in PEPC. As I noted before, there's always ways that we can improve our analysis, but I wanted to share these because the author does a good job of describing issues and impacts. The author does a good job identifying how a specific component of a proposed action will result in a specific impact. These issue statements allow you to focus your discussion. They eliminate broad analysis that might result if you just start with impacts from invasive species or impacts to museum collections. Instead, you're focusing on the specific issue around both the action and the impact. And that's why writing issue statements this way can be helpful. The discussion provides a very brief note of the impact itself, and most importantly, why or how the impact will be mitigated so that it will not be a big impact. I like this example because it's obviously a simple project and easy to depict. And again, for projects that have greater impacts, you'll likely need more analysis than this. I'd like to shift our discussion now to a couple other applications of CEs. First, I'm going to talk about programmatic CEs. Programmatic CEs are used to cover reoccurring actions or actions that the park may regularly do, but which require documentation. In order to create a programmatic CE, you will need to document all the information that we just discussed, and you should consider how often you're likely to use the CE when you're thinking about the impacts. Is it something you're doing every day, every month? Think about how often you're taking the action. If you're not sure what actions might be covered under a programmatic CE, you should consult your REC and talk with them about programmatic CEs that other parks have successfully used. When we looked at programmatic CEs that are most commonly used in the Park Service, we noticed that annual removal of vegetation from trails is an example, roadside mowing along park roads and in developed areas, issuances of commercial use authorizations, and in some cases, special use permits. Those are all examples of CEs or actions that parks have developed programmatic CEs for. Remember that when you develop a programmatic CE, it does not mean that you never have to consider NEPA again for that action. You should revisit your programmatic CEs to make sure that the action that you're doing is the action that you've actually described in your CE, and that the impacts of the action you documented are consistent with the impacts that you are actually seeing on the ground. You should note when you use a programmatic CE, and I know many of your RECs have examples of how parks can do this quickly and efficiently without a lot of work. So if you're not sure how to do that, please reach out to your REC. A caveat to the efficiency of programmatic CEs is that you still may need to document the use of the CE for Section 106 purposes. And I strongly encourage you to check with your 106 coordinator for these requirements. Similar requirements may apply if you're working under a biological opinion under the Endangered Species Act. Again, check with your park experts on these topics to determine whether you're properly complying with other requirements. The next three slides address CE adoption. CE adoption is new under the 2020 CEQ regulations. So prior to these regulations, you could only adopt an EA or an EIS. The 2020 regulations expanded that adoption to include CEs. I think it's important to begin by clarifying what CE adoption is not, because there's a lot of confusion about this. CE adoption is not looking at another agency's CE list and deciding that you want to use one of their CEs to cover your action. That is not CE adoption. CE adoption is adopting another agency's CE and documentation when the actions are substantially the same. Generally, there are two scenarios where we think CE adoption is appropriate. First, adoption may be appropriate when you have an action. Perhaps you both have a permit, you both have to permit an action or have jurisdiction over different parts of the same action. And one agency has a CE that covers the action, but the other does not. In this case, the agency that has the CE may document the action is covered by the CE, and the other agency may adopt that agency's CE. So let me clarify with an example. You may have a road project in your park for which both NPS and Federal Highways has an approving action. You're either issuing a permit or they have some action they're taking. If Federal Highways has a CE that covers the action, NPS potentially may adopt the Federal Highways CE for that action. Adoption may also be appropriate when one agency is taking an action and has a CE for that action, and another agency wants to take the same action but does not have a CE. So this scenario is a little bit more complicated, as there's important caveats that you should consider. Because adoption is only appropriate when actions covered by the CE are substantially the same, the two agencies should be basically taking the same action with the same tools and have roughly the same impacts. Okay, so for example, if an adjacent agency is taking an action to control invasive species on their land and they're using a CE for that action, you might be able to adopt their CE for the same action on NPS land. In this scenario, the action should be close in time. So you cannot look back 10 years for an action that another agency took and said, hey, I want to use that CE that they developed 10 years ago. Because of the nuance to using CE adoption in this way, we strongly recommend reaching out to either your REC or to our office to discuss before using CE adoption in this manner. Some additional considerations for you to consider about adopting CEs. There's generally no lead or cooperating agency in CE processes, but in cases where there may be agreements for specific projects, so for example, I know in some federal highway projects, there's sort of a lead and a cooperator identified. It does not matter who is lead for the purposes of adoption. A lead agency may adopt a cooperating agency's CE. Second, if you're adopting another agency's CE, they must document the CE first before you can adopt it. You must be able to review their CE justification and impact analysis in order to understand whether adoption is appropriate. So if you think you're going to adopt another agency's CE, we recommend that you work closely with that agency so that you can understand what information they're considering. You'll need their documentation before documenting your adoption. You can't simply say, hey, I heard, they did a CE, I'm going to adopt it. Finally, you should review the other agency's documentation to ensure that the actions are substantially the same and that you agree that the action fits within the CE and that there's adequate documentation for adoption. I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing what you will document if you're adopting another agency's CE. You can adopt another agency's CE in PEPC under the list of applicable CEs. At the bottom of the list, you would select adoption. In the description of the action or description of the project, you should describe the NPS action and the other agency's action, and why the actions are substantially the same. And that's bold because that's key. You can only adopt it if the actions are substantially the same. Otherwise, CE adoption is not appropriate. Next, you should identify the CE that the other agency used, and you should describe why the action fits within the CE. So for this, we recommend that you summarize and incorporate by reference the other agency's information. So in their documentation, in their justification, they should have described this information. You should document that the environmental impacts of the NPS action have been adequately covered or supplement where needed. You might need to provide additional site-specific information if that information wasn't covered by the other agency. Next, you should document that no extraordinary circumstances apply, and those are NPS extraordinary circumstances. So the other agency will have documentation that their extraordinary circumstances do not apply. It is not sufficient to rely on that. You must document that the NPS extraordinary circumstances do not apply, and those are in section 3.5 of the NPS handbook. You should document that NPS has completed consultations. Make sure that tribal, section 106, Endangered Species Act consultations, or any other applicable consultations are adequate and complete. When you're working cooperatively together on a project, for example, in the first situation where you're working with federal highways, maybe on a similar action or same action, these consultations are often done together. However, in cases where they are not, you must make sure consultation is adequate and complete. So in all cases, that is your responsibility. Finally, the National Park Service Park Superintendent must sign the CE adoption documentation. CE document adoption is new, and we expect people to have questions. So again, please reach out to either your REC or our office if you have questions. Finally, for our last slide, I want to review what you should keep in your decision file. It's important to keep a decision file for a CE just like any other NEPA document. So hopefully you're doing that for all of your NEPA document processes. In some cases, the decision file is simply the signed CE form, the ESF, or other impact analysis and consultation documentation. In other cases, you may have more information that you relied on to develop your CE. Anything that you relied on, reviewed, or considered to document your CE should be retained in the decision file, including references if they're not publicly available. While most regions require that you document your CEs in PEPC, PEPC is not a record storage system, so you should store your complete decision file consistent with your park system of records. Specifically, lengthy reference materials should not be stored on PEPC. However, we request that at a minimum, your signed CE form is uploaded or linked to PEPC. And people often ask why we need this. We have periodically had to provide substantiation documentation to CEQ about the CEs that we've used and documented, and it's very important to have signed CEs where we can locate them. Your region may have other requirements as well. Finally, implementation and finished other consultation. Thanks for joining us. I think we're now going to take questions, and you can either put them in the chat or raise your hand.